Today on Venezuela Explained, we'll take a look at a Council of the Americas interview where Eric Farnsworth talks with self-proclaimed opposition spokesman Leopoldo Lopez. We're going to take a look at some of the moments where Lopez is less than 100% honest in his answers to Eric, and I'll call out the moments when Lopez is lying. Hopefully, this helps English-speaking audiences better understand the huge disconnect between U.S. foreign policy and positive results on the ground in Venezuela. So let's jump right into the interview. One of the first things on which Lopez is gently confronted is the dying momentum in the fight against the regime.
Those protests in some ways have become reduced a little bit in previous months. What is the reason for that? Is the momentum dying out? How can we recapture that?
Well, I think there are two ways to answer that. First is that over the past 20 years, we've seen cycles. So we've seen cycles in mobilization, street protest, or voting, and it has been very clear that when expectations about change become present and very clearly presented to the people, people mobilize. But then comes the moments of less mobilization. But there are cycles.
This is a soft dodge of Eric's question. Lopez is saying that there are times when there is less mobilization, the quiet part being times like right now, but that there have been other times where the people do get out and fight for change. What Lopez is dodging is admitting that the people are historically demoralized, worse than they've ever been in more than 20 years of Chavista rule, and they're no longer coming out to protest for their freedom en masse like they were 3 years ago.
Well, the dynamic now is that the dictatorship has decided to repress at a level that we have never seen before. So going out and giving a piece of paper or doing a graffiti in a wall in Venezuela can take you to prison. And I'm not saying that hypothetically. That happened 3 months ago when a group of the young movement of our political party was commemorating the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Neomar Lander, who was a protester that was killed by Maduro with a shot in his chest. And this is a process that is very complex. It's not just the repression in the streets, but it's also the level of social control that the entire society is exposed to. Social control that has been getting support from China, from Russia. Social control that it's not only the conditioning of the people to have access or not to the programs or the jobs or the benefits that are very few of the dictatorship, but also social conditioning through the manipulation of communications and social media. So it's very clear now that Maduro is not alone.
He just described his country becoming a totalitarian country. It was already a repressive authoritarian dictatorship at the time when Lopez went to prison, but with the historic levels of repression added when Chavismo controls the economy, access to public benefits, and the media, dude, that's a totalitarian state. In a few minutes, Lopez is going to start talking about elections, which is an absurd thing to expect in a totalitarian state. The only time a Marxist dictatorship had a free election and respected the results was Nicaragua in 1990. And that was after a decade of civil war where people fought back against Ortega with guns.
And he is playing with an asymmetrical advantage, the power of the state as well as the support of other countries around the world against the people of Venezuela. That's a very disequal equilibrium.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at it in numbers, is 80% of the people in Venezuela want change.
Well, he knows 80% of his people want change. Yet his political faction did everything it could to detract from the change the people wanted and so desperately needed. Also, according to recent polls by Mega-Analysis, more than 80% of the Venezuelan people support neither Maduro's party nor the opposition. So he's right that 80% of the people want change, but that change does not include him.
Maduro, as you said, has the state, the military, the police, but also the non-state armed forces. So Venezuela has become a territory where the Cartel de Sinaloa is openly doing business, the FARC, the ELN, the Wagner Group, Hezbollah. All of this, we've been saying it for years. And for many years, we were thought as exaggerating. People said, well, that cannot be true. How can you say Hezbollah or FARC or Sinaloa cartel are in Venezuela.
He just named off a laundry list of terrorist organizations, and they really are present and in charge of huge chunks of the country, not just the border areas, but way inland as well. However, his claim that they were sounding the alarm for years is disingenuous as all hell. Most of the opposition, including Lopez's own party, downplayed the presence of these groups for years, because talking about them was politically inconvenient. Worst of all the times the opposition dialogued with the regime, not once did they ever bring up the presence of these foreign actors and terrorist groups inside the country. They were always content to agree on stupid crap like the Essequibo is part of Venezuela, and then to just go to another round of elections with the PSUV and ignore the presence of these foreign terrorist groups, some of which the regime had sheltered in Venezuela since Chavez openly courted them in the mid-2000s. In fact, Lopez's party didn't say anything about the guerrilla armies with a vice grip on the country until late in 2018, well over a decade after the FARC and ELN made a permanent home for themselves in Venezuela. I did a deep dive on Google, and the earliest of Lopez's public statements about the guerrillas that I found is from December 2020. The opposition has not been talking about it for years. They mentioned it every once in a long while when it was politically convenient for them, long after the invasion was common public knowledge.
You talked a little bit about the cycles of maintaining momentum in terms of the protest movement at the national level. How do you maintain your own personal motivation? This is costly.
I think the answer to that is to be very clear about the purpose, about why we fight. I mean, what we strive for. Is it for just being candidates or just to have a position? The answer to me is no.
This is where he tells on himself. Is it about just running candidates and having positions? To him, the answer is no. What the hell does that mean? To him, the answer is no. For starters, who even asked about that? Eric did not say a word about candidates and public offices. He asked what personally motivates Leopoldo. So why did Lopez start off his answer by refuting the theoretical accusation that the opposition is fighting just to run candidates and have a few positions? Why is he answering a question that nobody asked? He's telling on himself.
But it's a lonely fight, I can tell you that. It's many times you are questioned, many times that there are no clear ways to go forward, so you need to walk a very lonely road to continue.
I walk a lonely road, the only one that I have ever known. Don't know where it goes, but it's home to me and I walk alone.
Many times they are questioned. That is true. Everywhere Lopez and other opposition politicians go, Venezuelans heckle them about sitting on their asses while Chavismo and its international allies devour the country and its population. As far as the road ahead not being clear, this is absolutely false. For starters, in the winter and spring of 2019, the majority of Venezuelans who don't support the regime or the Chavismo movement were publicly clamoring for the interim government to request an international intervention in Venezuela. They were specifically invoking Article 187, Section 11, which authorizes international interventions for humanitarian purposes. The legitimate Supreme Court issued an arrest warrant for Maduro and a decision authorizing an international humanitarian intervention in 2019. The majority of member states in the OAS were waiting on Guaidó and the National Assembly to ratify the Rio Treaty so that said intervention would be legal and not technically an invasion. When Guaidó visited Miami in January 2020, crowds of exiled Venezuelans were shouting, "Intervención ya!" Intervention now. You can't get more clear than that. On top of that, talking about the road ahead not being clear, the opposition leaders knew from the very beginning what they were going to do. On January 17th, 2019, before Guaidó was even the interim president, there was a meeting between the leaders of Venezuela's big four opposition parties and the Brazilian government. Eduardo Bolsonaro was there on the Brazilian side. the Brazilians were willing to work with the opposition by letting a new Venezuelan government operate from Brazil to expel Maduro's regime from Venezuela. This was where the Venezuelans told the Brazilians that they preferred to negotiate with the PSUV and have elections for a new government, sharing the ballot with Chavismo. Fast forward 3.5 years later, and the opposition is preparing candidates for the 2024 presidential election. They knew what their path was the whole time, so Lopez is full of it when he laments that the road ahead is unclear.
There is territorial presence of political parties, of civil society. Now, as we speak, there are protests happening in Venezuela, not only in Caracas, but in many of the main cities, led by the teachers, by the nurses, by the public servants. So that is something that we need to take into consideration.
These protests are not like the protests that happened in 2014, 2017, and 2020, where people were in the streets in the millions to demand Maduro leave office and the government respect the Constitution. The protests happening right now are teachers and nurses resigned to living under the regime's authority, demanding that said regime pay them better wages. This is not the beginning of some wave of momentum that Leopoldo will ride to ousting Maduro from power. It's just not.
Now we know the truth. So that's what we are facing. It's not just a dictatorship. It's a criminal structure that uses the resources of Venezuela, oil, gold, now cocaine trafficking, money laundering.
The illegal gold mining, the cocaine trafficking, and the money laundering are how the regime evades sanctions. So how in the hell does this guy expect this criminal network to have a free and fair election and then peacefully give up power if they lose again like they lost in 2015? I think he knows it's not going to happen, but he also knows the US will keep funding the opposition if they keep up the charade of fighting for democracy, which really means fighting for US interests in the long term. Which means, hey, let these American oil companies into the country and stop arresting Americans and maybe shoot your people less, but the first two are the more important points. Having elections with the Suns cartel is as productive as dieting on donuts.
So once you have a clear understanding of who's behind each one of these pillars of the organized crime, well, then you have the possibility of using the tools that are available for the US, for Europe. Sanctions is one of them. And I think the way forward, what you ask, is that there needs to be the buildup of pressure from within and pressure coming from outside. And creating that moment of internal and external pressure is the best moment that you can create for a positive outcome for negotiations.
Bingo, he let the cat out of the bag by mentioning negotiations. That part is true, and I do agree with that on the surface, but again, he's not being upfront about what his political faction has been up to for years. The Vichy opposition's go-to strategy has not been to fight the regime, but to negotiate to coexist and to share a little bit of the regime's power. The opposition has had a whole series of failed dialogues with the regime since Capriles cried uncle in the 2013 elections and conceded to Maduro despite credible allegations of electoral fraud by the PSUV. The regime only ever negotiates when it needs to buy time for its own survival. Then they drag the dialogue out, they get concessions out of the opposition, and they barely give up anything in return, if they give up anything at all. And Lopez knows that the US is starting to phase out sanctions on the regime so American oil companies can get that Venezuelan oil again. He also knows that members of his own party in the interim government have been actively lobbying the US to lift sanctions so that the regime comes back to the dialogue table, which it abandoned after it got what it wanted in Mexico City: a few token opposition candidates to be useful idiots in a rigged election where Chavismo gave itself 20 out of 24 governorships, and forced the new opposition governors to recognize Maduro as president and not Guaido. And what will the opposition negotiate with the regime at the next dialogue, whenever that may be? Releasing the political prisoners being tortured at the helicoid? No. Restoring private property to the millions of Venezuelans whose houses were taken over by the regime while they were abroad looking for work, and then given out to regime loyalists? No. allowing a couple of large humanitarian aid convoys into Caracas and allowing NGOs to distribute food and medicine without regime interference? No, not even. They'll be negotiating which opposition candidates and how many of them the regime will allow on the 2024 ballot.
What we have been asking, not now, but for many years, I personally did a 28-day hunger strike. I lost 14 kilos for this. Free and fair elections. That's what we want. We want what Petro just had in Colombia. We want what Boric had in Chile.
Yes, the Venezuelan people want free and fair elections, asterisk. The asterisk is that first, they want this regime gone. They want a free society right now where the government is not putting people in jail over their social media posts, and where there's a modicum of security and safety in the streets. They want food and medicine, both of which are overpriced and in horribly short supply. Those are their immediate demands. When all of these emergency needs have been met, then the people are game for free and fair elections, but not before. The Venezuelan people put their faith in Guaidó and Lopez. They followed Guaidó and Lopez into harm's way on April 30th, on February 23rd, and on many other days. They demanded an intervention under Article 187 of the Constitution, and the Vichy opposition, including Leopoldo Lopez, knew from the very beginning that they would go straight to the dialogue table and only pretend to fight the regime, while their whole game plan was waiting for the next presidential election. That is so wrong, and people have died because of the Vichy opposition's phony struggle against the dictatorship.
Cuando vienen los Marines, por ahí me decían, bueno, aquí está Franklin Marín, Carlos Marín. Aquí hay varios. Aquí hay varios, aquí están. Aquí hay otro Marín.
First, it's very important to understand that the root of the humanitarian crisis is a dictatorship. It's Maduro. It's not the war or it's not an environmental disaster. It's Maduro.
Not true. Maduro was and is a catalyst for the crisis, but the roots go deeper than him. He was a nobody until Chavez made him vice president. The roots are Chavez himself and the Cuban military occupation, which Chavez himself ushered in. According to a top-notch investigation by the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, at any given moment, there are around 45,000 Cuban soldiers in Venezuela, with most of them wearing either Venezuelan uniforms or civilian clothes, and even trained to speak in Venezuelan dialects. There are Cubans at every military base in the country, ensuring the Venezuelan soldiers don't rebel. The thousands of Cuban doctors and medical support staff working in Venezuela are reserve soldiers and national militiamen. The 30,000 other civilian advisors that Havana has working in Venezuela are members of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, one of the Cuban Communist Party's hybrid militias and neighborhood spy organizations that help the regime keep control of the island. The Venezuelan dissident Lawrence Saleh recalls hearing Cuban accents among his torturers during the 4 years he was underground in the helicoid. There are hundreds of Cubans physically guarding Maduro at any moment, in addition to the Venezuelan presidential guards. That's the root of the present situation in Venezuela. It's a Cuban colony that serves as a base to grow and expand organized crime, Marxist insurgencies, and far-left political parties across all of Latin America. As I said, one of the main roots of this evil, sickly tree is Chavez himself, who wanted to be Fidel Castro 2.0 and turn Venezuela into a revolutionary state like Cuba. That's why it grinds my gears to hear Leopoldo's wife saying in speeches that what's happening in Venezuela today is not what Chavez wanted for his people.
Maduro no es Chávez, y Maduro rompió con el legado que le dejó Chávez. Y ese es el descontento que tenemos todos los venezolanos. Los chavistas no me lo puedo imaginar, el dolor que pueden sentir. Y los que no somos chavistas, pues también sentimos una gran frustración, porque el legado no lo continuó.
Well, yes, it is what Chavez wanted for his people. He never trusted the people again after he lost his beloved reform referendum of 2007. As early as 2002, he tried to start a civil war in the capital, which got him briefly removed from power. Then he got government funding for the paramilitary collectives. Plus, he started building a parallel army that answered only to him, which became the National Militia, built on the Cuban model. He locked up incorruptible public servants like Judge Maria Afiuni and subjected them to all kinds of physical and sexual violence. He used the Ministry of Justice to chase journalists like Patricia Poleo out of the country. He promised Fidel Castro a 40-year collaboration between Venezuela and Cuba, and gave safe haven to the FARC and ELN. Turning Venezuela into a Marxist state with a military strongman and an economy that leaves people too poor for dissident political activity is exactly what Chavez wanted for his people. The Lopezes know this, yet they still pander and say the line that Chavez never wanted this. The only reason that they would be pandering like this is if they're trying to get votes. So $5 says Leopoldo wants to run for president in 2024.
We've voted, we've lost, and we've won. We won 2/3 of the National Assembly. We've gone to negotiations. We've done everything, and we will continue to do so. But what we ask is that the sight always remains in making political change towards democratization possible for the Venezuelan people. That's what we ask the American government. That's what we ask Congress. That's what we ask the American people. That's what we ask the rest of the continent.
He's not being completely honest here. He did say elections, but diplomatic support for free and fair elections is not all that his political faction asked from the American government. They've asked for money. A lot of money. Several times. For years. The US has given money directly to the interim government as aid to help it function until it could acquire its own capital from the regime's assets frozen abroad. The US has also spent over $1 billion in multiple aid packages for Venezuela through US aid over the last 6 years. There are a lot of Venezuelans asking what happened to all the humanitarian aid that these $1 billion+ could have bought, because they sure as hell never saw millions and millions of dollars worth of humanitarian aid, neither inside the country, nor when they were sleeping in the streets of Colombia, or hiking through the Darien Gap, or trying to get asylum when they crossed the Rio Grande and were locked up by ICE. Lopez probably knows exactly where most or all of the US humanitarian aid funds have gone and continue to go as the US makes more payments according to the current USAID treaty with the interim government. He's one of the big fish in Juan Guaido's party and is commonly known as the young Guaido's political mentor. He's the only Venezuelan that Guaido's failed April 30th uprising actually freed, which is very telling. Esteban Hernandez of Contrapoder News asked Lopez about the humanitarian aid funds at the Oslo Freedom Forum in October 2021.
Con ellos y han habido acusaciones recientes por parte de incluso partidos políticos de Venezuela que han apuntado hacia su partido Voluntad Popular y hacia su persona directamente con respecto al tema de monómeros y también con el tema de la ayuda humanitaria. Quisiera que nos dijera, porque siempre dicen que ningún líder ni ninguna organización manejó recursos, ¿no? Sino que lo hicieron las ONG, que nos diera por favor los nombres de las ONG que lo manejaron. Muchas gracias. ¿Se pudiera identificar del medio? Contrapoder News, Esteban Hernández. Contrapoder News.
Here's what Lopez said.
Bueno, buenos días, muchísimas gracias. Gracias por la invitación, muy contento por estar aquí en el Oslo Freedom Forum. Creo que en estos últimos años ha crecido mucho este espacio. Un espacio para quienes estamos convencidos que hay que luchar por la libertad, por los derechos humanos y para la conquista de la democracia en los países donde no la tenemos.
Oh my gosh, answer the question already.
Con respecto a tu pregunta muy concreta, te respondo como la respondió el gobierno norteamericano. La ayuda humanitaria en el año 2019 fue entregada por USAID, por Estados Unidos, y tal como lo dijeron en reiteradas oportunidades, el gobierno interino de Juan Guaidó no administró ni un solo dólar de lo que fueron los recursos destinados a la ayuda humanitaria. Eso lo dijo incluso recientemente cuando le volvieron a preguntar a Elliot Abrams, que era la persona encargada del tema de Venezuela durante la administración de Trump. Y eso es así. Allí no ha habido una administración directa de esos recursos.
Bueno, no había una administración directa, tampoco hubo una respuesta. Esteban.
No, totalmente.
Let's break that down. Lopez starts off with a whole bunch of fluff about the Oslo Freedom Forum and the very concept of freedom, none of which have anything to do with the question, so it's obviously a tactic to stall for time. When he finally gets to the humanitarian aid, he plays a few rhetorical tricks. First, he nails down the humanitarian aid funds to the year 2019. 2019 is just 1 year in several that the US has given aid funds to Venezuelan NGOs and foreign NGOs serving Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Between 2017 and 2022, Uncle Sam has doled out over $1 billion to Venezuela and Venezuelans, but the average person has not seen a dime of that. Next, Lopez hides behind the US government, saying he's citing the US government's public declarations that the Venezuelans did not administer even $1 single of the humanitarian aid funds. That is a bold-faced lie, on 2 separate counts. What the director at the time of USAID actually said is that USAID never sent any money to the Venezuelan interim government. It sent the money to NGOs. The US Agency for International Development did not say that no Venezuelan had administrative power over any of the humanitarian aid funds. That's the first part of the lie. The other lie is that the Venezuelans had nothing to do with administering the aid money. We now know, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, that not only were the Venezuelans involved in how the aid money was allocated, but the currently active contract between USAID and the interim government specifically identifies Ambassador Carlos Vecchio as the principal grantee, the chief officer in charge of implementing the aid programs funded by the agreement. Moreover, the Venezuelan Embassy's Office for International Cooperation was given the responsibility of deciding how these funds were allocated. That means if Uncle Sam was the executive producer financing the production of this novella, Carlos Vecchio was the director, and he decided which actors got paid and how much. It's on paper, in a federal government document that's public record. Yes, the Vichy opposition was absolutely in control of the humanitarian aid funds. Leopoldo Lopez lied through his teeth to Esteban's face right in front of the free world's rolling cameras. And worst of all, he didn't actually answer the question. Esteban asked who some of these NGOs are, and he did not name a single one. Oh, and by the way, for extra context, it's also in the USAID contract that the US will continue funding NGOs chosen by Carlos Vecchio until September of 2024, right before the presidential election. That changes things, doesn't it? Even though we just watched him lie, and saw hard evidence that he lied, I'll give Lopez the benefit of the doubt for just a moment. Let's say Vecchio and Guaido lied to Lopez about USAID, and he's simply been taking his closest political allies at their word. He was still verifiably wrong. I've been on Venezuelan TV several times showing evidence that his assertions are wrong, and he should publicly apologize for misguiding people on the humanitarian aid money. This is information both the US taxpayers and Venezuelan people deserve to know. This is anything but a closed case, and the false opposition keeps trying to act like it is a closed case and you're just being a pot stirrer by trying to bring things up again.
Y de hecho te comento, cuando salí después de esa conferencia de prensa, que salí a los pasillos acá del foro, el señor me ha agarrado, o sea, en los pasillos me dice, oye, muy buena pregunta que le hiciste, y te diste cuenta que Leopoldo López no tiene nada que ver con eso, ¿cierto? Porque te contestó todo, y yo le dije, no me contestó absolutamente nada. Entonces él me dijo, con un tono bastante arrogante, he de destacar, bueno, el hecho de que no te haya contestado como tú quisieras no significa que no te haya contestado. A lo que yo le respondí, yo le pedí específicamente los nombres y eso no lo hizo. Así que el venezolano que juzgue, definitivamente cuando la gente tiene muchas cosas que ocultar, Colina, suceden este tipo de cosas. Algo tan directo no lo pueden contestar.
Do you have much hope in a negotiated solution here, and how do we get to that point?
Well, we've been through this many different times. I think it's a mistake to put all of the eggs in that one basket, to only think about the negotiation as the only thing to do.
For successful negotiations, I mean, it has to be a ratchet, right? If there's, if the regime is making concessions and showing goodwill, maybe you can bring down the sanctions a little bit, but if they continue to be obstinate, why do we talk about reducing sanctions? We should talk about increasing sanctions.
I fully agree with that. And I think that in order to produce any meaningful outcome from the negotiation, we need to be very clear that we need internal pressure and external pressure. And that combination is what's going to make Maduro and his cronies to make decisions to go forward with negotiations.
This smells like yet another bad faith answer to me. Since I feel generous, I'll momentarily give Leopoldo Lopez the benefit of the doubt one more time. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that he really does agree that sanctions on the regime should be increased. Unfortunately, that's not the course of action he and his party are actually following. Instead of keeping sanctions removal as a reward for coming back to the negotiating table and successfully reaching an agreement, Lopez's own party, along with the rest of the top dog opposition parties, keep asking the US government to lift sanctions just so the regime will come back to the dialogue table. That's pathetic. It plays straight into the regime's hands, and Lopez said so himself. Yet the Vichy opposition is hell-bent on staying the course, being the first to hand concessions over to the regime and negotiating for the regime to allow their parties on the ballot in 2024. Right now, the most important thing for them is to keep milking the US for money and get ready for the 2024 elections. I think Lopez is going to run for president in 2024, and he needs successful negotiations so he can appear on the ballot and then come back to Venezuela with the guarantee of his personal safety. Some folks might ask, how is Lopez going to run for president when Juan Guaido is already a Voluntad Popular candidate for 2024? Easy. The parties have to have their primary elections and pick their candidates for the general election. Both Guaido and Lopez can run in the primaries for Voluntad Popular. They can campaign and get media airtime for their own brands, which they can then translate into a job somewhere if they lose the primary. They can travel around the world fundraising from businessmen who would love to be enchufados under an opposition-controlled government, and even milk more money in small donations from hopeful people in the diaspora. They can use that money to pay themselves, create campaign jobs for their friends and followers, have lavish dinners, have parties, and pay for their lifestyles by writing off campaign expenses. These elections mean everything to these opposition politicians because career politicians need elections and they need to fundraise. And in order to fundraise, the more hated ones have to sell out special interests. None of these things can happen if there are drone strikes in the capital or if there's a Venezuelan Liberation Army shooting it out with the Tupamaro Collective in the streets. That's the real reason why Guaido said a long time ago that an armed insurgency is not an option.
If Maduro is comfortable, if he has more legitimacy, if he has more funds, if he has no pressure, why would he negotiate? I mean, why would he make a decision to open the democratization process in Venezuela?
That's a very good question, Leopoldo. Why don't you ask your own party, including fellow party members President Guaido and Ambassador Vecchio, why they keep asking Uncle Sam to lift sanctions on the regime? Sanctions relief and asking to resume negotiations so their candidates can be on the ballot is the Vichy opposition's whole game plan. They don't care about the starving and dying people. Lopez has to know this, yet in this conversation he's telling Eric that the right path is to keep up the pressure. That tells me that he knows the opposition, especially his own party, is on the wrong path, but he'll never admit that in public, nor will he publicly go against his party. The US government does not want a land war in Venezuela, I understand that. But the truth is that a few drone strikes, no ground troops, just drones, at Fort Tayuna, La Carlota Air Base, and Miraflores Palace will get Chavismo back to the negotiating table on the double. But some opposition politicians might get nabbed by the regime as hostages, and these politicians will never put their own necks on the line. They gamble with the common people's lives and well-being, not with their own. And I know Lopez was in prison for 5 years and he claims that he was tortured, but fewer and fewer people are swayed by his tales of suffering. Compare Lopez's condition when he was released from prison to house arrest with the condition of Captain Caguaripano or Captain Acosta Arevalo, and you can see what real torture looks like. Leopoldo Lopez did not look like any of these guys who was tortured for real. This is where it gets more interesting. Just 3 months ago, this man who was in the military prison with Lopez confronts him face to face and dresses him down for doing nothing for the political prisoners.
Leopoldo, buenas tardes, ¿cómo estás? Compartí cárcel contigo 4 años en Campo Verde. También fui torturado, tenía tiempo que no te veía. Saludos a tu esposa. Pero hay cosas que no se hablaron, Leopoldo. Los presos políticos están olvidados, Leopoldo. Y el gobierno interino está recibiendo millones de dólares, Leopoldo, en cálculo. Y están ahí los números. El 0.02% alcanzaría para solucionar la situación alimentaria y médica de los presos políticos. Están olvidados y confiamos en ti, Leopoldo. Tú estás hablando de la libertad y la democracia en Latinoamérica. Y yo no sé por qué, Leopoldo, pero mi óptica, que sudé y literalmente sangré en la cárcel, porque todavía tengo pesadillas, también tengo comunicación con los familiares y estoy autorizado y soy representante de los familiares de los torturados, de los asesinados, de los presos políticos que están ahí. Y me preguntan, Eduardo y Leopoldo, ¿qué pasó? En el 2015, España recibió a 150 cubanos, presos políticos y familiares. ¿Por qué no se aboga porque Europa reciba a los presos políticos? Hay presos políticos que tienen 9 años. Hay personas que una infección en la cárcel, una uña encarnada, una gripe se transforma en una patología monstruosa que te devora. Y se necesita ayuda, pero ayuda real, porque mi impresión y la impresión de todos los presos políticos a los cuales represento, la impresión es, somos utilizados solo como ficha de canje y nos olvidan y no abogan por nosotros, por la libertad, porque entonces ya no habría excusa para decir que en Venezuela hay una dictadura. No podemos seguir con esta estrategia fabiana de esperar que Nicolás Maduro muera de viejo. No podemos seguir negociando con la dictadura, porque esto no es un partido de fútbol, donde, bueno, el fin justifica los medios. No, porque cada delación que se hace, o cada vez que se dilata una acción, o cada vez que tú dices, bueno, es que la estrategia es esta ahora, está muriendo gente, Leopoldo. Hay gente con hambre y el país está en miseria absoluta. Yo quiero volver a Venezuela. Yo espero volver a Venezuela pronto y bueno.
His points are clear as day. Leopoldo, you've received millions of dollars, you keep talking about freedom, but you've done nothing. Frankly, screw what Lopez has to say. I would love to see Eric Farnsworth interview that other guy. But that begs one question. Would Leopoldo be happy if Eric talked with his fellow prisoner and fellow victim of torture who has a different perspective than Lopez? I don't think he would, for some reason. And it's not new that pro-democracy Venezuelans are confronting Lopez and protesting Lopez. This has been happening around the world. While Lopez was at the Miami Oslo Freedom Forum in October 21, the one where he lied about the humanitarian aid, there were Venezuelan and Cuban exiles outside the building protesting his presence. Earlier that year in May, some angry Venezuelan exiles protested against him in Peru. This woman here, who's one of Lopez's loyal, useful idiots, asked the protesters what they've done to help free the country. Their answer? They were in the guarimbas. The guarimbas were the intense episodes of the 2014, 2017, and 2019 protests where protesters put up large barricades in the streets and fought with the National Guard and the police hand to hand. I know a couple of these protesters, and their claims are true. They really did physically fight against Maduro's thugs, and they're absolutely right to accuse Lopez of being false opposition. It gets even worse. Since he left Venezuela for exile and a never-ending world speaking tour, Lopez has refused to be upfront about his personal finances. Because of his imprisonment, his house arrest, and then after that, since he left Venezuela, he hasn't had a regular job like other people in his party who at least have some kind of post with regular duties for which they draw a salary. He refuses to disclose how he and his family are able to afford living in a €15,000 a month luxury apartment in Madrid. He won't say who pays for his airfare as he travels around the world flying in first class. His wife even takes it a step further and claims that the Lopezes live off of small donations from ordinary citizens who support their work.
Económicamente, ¿cómo mantienes la familia?
Económicamente tenemos apoyo de venezolanos que están regados por el mundo, que quieren volver a Venezuela. Te quiero contar algo que no le he contado a nadie. Estaba en el aeropuerto. Se me acercó un venezolano. Me dijo, yo me tuve que venir, pero yo estoy aquí y yo admiro la lucha que ustedes en Venezuela están dando. Y te quiero ayudar y te voy a ayudar. Pero yo no tengo tanto. Abrió su cartera, sacó $100 y me dijo, toma, este es mi apoyo.
That's right, she literally claimed people walk up to her and hand her small bill donations to continue fighting the good fight. Come on, give me a break. But wait, there's more! We still have the ongoing Monómeros scandal, in which Lopez has his hands dirty, very dirty. Monómeros Colombo Venezolanos is a chemical company based in Colombia that manufactures fertilizers, among other things, and is one of many private foreign businesses owned by the Venezuelan government. After Guaidó was sworn in, the Colombian government booted Maduro's people and let Guaidó's people take over, since Colombia recognized his interim government. The company was investigated by Sintra Monómeros, the Monómeros Workers Union, after receiving multiple whistleblower reports of gross financial improprieties during the time of the interim government's control of the company. According to Guaidó's former ambassador to Colombia, Calderón Bertí, who turned whistleblower and talked to the Colombian Justice Department, Lopez is directly to blame for the company's current dumpster fire status. Bertí directly said Leopoldo Lopez is the driving force behind the interim president nominating people to the boards of state-owned businesses abroad based on partisan political reliability and not on technical skill. Is there anything to back that up? Actually, yes. The chief executive at Monómeros during the time frame of a certain missing $100 million was Carmen Elisa Hernández. That's her on the right in this photo, greeting Lopez on one of his arrivals in Colombia. She's known as one of Lopez's political protégés in Voluntad Popular and was appointed by Juan Guaidó under Lopez's direction. One of the ways the executive board of Monómeros was allegedly embezzling company funds was through repeatedly hiring a series of unnecessary consultants and paying them exorbitant consulting fees. Politically well-connected people were billing the company $3,000 reimbursements for cups of coffee purchased for supposed business meetings. Board members and executives raised their own salaries up to 6 or 7 figures, beyond justification for their positions and responsibilities. On a live stream with the journalist Sergio Novelli, Juan Guaidó promised transparency and that the interim government would release the budget for Monómeros.
Y solamente concluyo lo final. Y algo distinto es la rendición de cuentas que debe dar cada una de las juntas directivas que se designaron en las empresas del Estado, que tampoco se maneja absolutamente y porque no se puede además.
That was over a year ago, and he still has not kept that promise. Lopez is quoted verbatim in this Voice of America newsreel trying to run interference for Guaidó and Monómeros.
El presidente Guaidó ha dicho, y lo va a anunciar en los próximos días, que va a hacer una reestructuración profunda y que quede muy claro qué es lo que allí ocurrió. Lo que sí es cierto es que allí hay que hacer una reestructuración tanto de la gerencia como de la junta directiva.
Assemblymen from the Rump National Assembly's July 16th parliamentary bloc have formally requested in writing that the interim president provide the books for over $100 million released to Monómeros by OFAC that have gone unaccounted for since 2020. The ever-shrinking Guaidó administration has repeatedly dodged and ignored this request. Here's Assemblyman Freddy Guevara of Lopez's political party running interference for the interim government in an interview with journalist Miguel Ángel Rodríguez at the beginning of the Monómeros scandal's outbreak in 2020.
Monómeros hizo su rendición de cuentas frente a la Asamblea Nacional. Y Citgo tiene el Departamento de Justicia metido en las oficinas de Citgo. Monómeros es una empresa que funciona en Colombia. Si hubiese un mínimo de corrupción en Citgo, ahí está, no es que estuvo porque es aliado nuestro, es el Departamento de Justicia, está metido dentro de Citgo. Y en Monómeros ya estuviese metido de cabeza Petro, a Córdoba y la FARC acusándonos de eso.
Now that in 2022, Colombia has a new administration that's openly sympathetic to Maduro and the Cuban regime, you can bet the Colombian government will go after the people responsible. That's probably why Guaidó's ex-foreign minister, Julio Borges, is privately negotiating with the regime for conditions to return to Venezuela, while also trying to put all the heat for the Monómeros scandal on Guaidó and Lopez. With the far left running the Colombian government and inheriting an investigation into Monómeros, Borges can either go to prison in Colombia, or the undisputed leader of one of the big four parties can make a deal for his safety and play ball in Venezuela by Maduro's rules. Either way, the Maduro regime wins. Americans really do a disservice to Venezuelans when they give their time and attention to charlatans like Leopoldo Lopez. I mean no disrespect whatsoever to Eric Farnsworth. He has no idea that Lopez is a grifter who actively uses his country's desperate people as a bargaining chip to advance his own career and fund his lifestyle. Eric is a former State Department man, so he's getting his information about the struggle directly from Venezuelan diplomats, meaning opposition politicians with an official title, like Carlos Vecchio, and other opposition politicians without a title, like Leopoldo Lopez, the kingmaker of Voluntad Popular. All of these guys have a vested interest in trying to sell foreign policy influencers like Eric on supporting the unitary platform. But as we've seen in this video, Leopoldo Lopez is just another corrupt, lying politician, a minnow in an ocean of petrostate patronage. If Lopez was really in touch with the average Venezuelan, he would know and accept that most Venezuelans hate him and the rest of the Vichy opposition. According to data from the survey firm Meganalysis, 90% of voting-age Venezuelans don't belong to any party, Chavismo or opposition. 5 years ago, that number would have been way lower. 70% of voting-age Venezuelans do not believe that voting can bring the changes the country desperately needs. 77% of them rightfully believe that the opposition parties have sold out to the regime. It's not an exaggeration that most Venezuelans hate opposition politicians like Leopoldo Lopez. It is statistically validated. People hate these guys for selling out to the regime, for dragging out the crisis, for always backing off and giving the regime breathing room at the most critical moments, and for forcing the burden of elections with the regime with only corrupt politicians on the ballot, as if the corruption is somehow supposed to be better because this time it's not the Chavistas doing it. The Bolivarian Revolution has killed over 400,000 Venezuelans in 23 years. That's 30% more fatalities than all deaths in the US war in Afghanistan in almost the same amount of time, along with Venezuela's diaspora being even bigger than the Afghan diaspora. And the Vichy opposition insists that the only way forward is to negotiate with these monsters and share the ballot with them. That's an insult to the heroic dead, like Oscar Perez, and the many protesters who were shot dead in the streets. It's an insult to the people suffering under the regime who are just a bargaining chip for the opposition to keep getting American money. Unfortunately, the only way forward for Venezuela to crawl out of this nightmare hellscape is through armed conflict. The Cuban soldiers, the FARC dissidents and ELN, Hezbollah, the transnational criminal gangs, and the urban collectives will never leave Venezuela. They're the rings of security for the regime. They have to be surgically extracted from the whole country. This is something that the Venezuelans themselves will have to do, although they can't do it alone. There are several strategies they could follow. One is the prodigal son model, where exiles return en masse to liberate the country. I don't mean just 1,000 guys like in the Bay of Pigs incident. I mean hundreds of thousands. Something based on the Free French Army in World War II, which started out in exile but eventually marched into Paris with the Allies. There are countries in the free world with battle-tested troops and veterans who could train hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan exiles to make a free Venezuelan army. Maduro and the Cubans can take whatever measures they want to fortify the country, but if an army of 100,000 Venezuelans, armed and trained by Americans and British, crosses the border or does an amphibious landing on the Caribbean coast, it's over for the regime. Another model is the Irish Republican model, developed by the Sinn Féin Party and the Provisional IRA. This strategy is called the rifle and the ballot box, where political activism in electoral politics is combined with insurgent violence in order to keep the regime honest and hold it to fulfill its agreements. Another option is a more modern approach, albeit a riskier one, where Uncle Sam drone strikes regime targets in Venezuela every day for months at a time, while also inviting Maduro, Diosdado, Jorge and Delcy Rodriguez, Vladimir Padrino, and Michael Moreno to leave the country and retire from politics forever. These are just ideas, but for all the Guaido lovers asking me sarcastically what I propose, these are viable ideas tailored to the present reality of the situation on the ground. In case these ideas horrify anyone, let me remind them that more than 400,000 people have been killed by the Bolivarian Revolution. Venezuelan dissidents with foreign backing could wage a war of liberation in which 100,000 people are killed, and it would still be more than 75% less lethal than the regime's continued hegemony over Venezuela. Plus, the national mortality index would drop year by year as violent crime goes down, people actually have enough to eat, the economy gets back on track for real, not just a bubble benefiting Chavista cronies, and the sick can actually get medicine, and patients in the ICU have a reliable power grid for their life-saving machines. But this isn't what Leopoldo Lopez wants to achieve, at least not in the short term. Lopez, along with many other charlatans in the Vichy opposition, are perfectly willing to let the Venezuela crisis drag on for another 3 years, since the 2024 president-elect won't take office until 2025. 3 more years of hyperinflation, rampant violent crime in the streets, of not having enough to eat, violent repression by the regime's army, police, and paramilitary enforcers, including extrajudicial executions, preventable deaths from malnutrition and diseases made deadly once again by the collapse of the country's economy and health systems under the Cuban model. 3 more years of pain, horror, and death, all because Leopoldo and his family want to live in luxury and be the new rulers of Venezuela and get their friends paid in the process. Thank you for watching Venezuela Explained. If you're from the English-speaking world or you're a non-Venezuelan and you really want to help the struggle for Venezuelan freedom, don't support charlatans like Leopoldo Lopez and Juan Guaidó. Support Guarimberos. That's all for now, folks.